affordability. Every West Australian deserves a fair chance to have a home. This bill is a step in the right direction and we support it. But the government has much more work to do.
That's for Warren Blackwood.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, I rise to speak on this finance legislation amendment, Housing Affordability Bill 2026. So this bill delivers the government's third transfer duty cut for home buyers. The maximum benefit is $22,515 on a new established home and $25,390 on a vacant land and construction. That is real money for people trying to get into their first home, and I welcome that assistance. But if we're going to call this a housing affordability bill, we need to look beyond transfer duty. We need to look at what it actually costs someone to buy land, get approval and build a home. That is particularly important in regional West Australia. I've spoken in this House before about the housing problems facing Warren Blackwood. We have had the land in many of our communities. We have the people who want to build, but too often the costs of headworks, power and water servicing, planning requirements and inconsistent bushfire assessments make otherwise sensible projects too difficult or too expensive to build. That means houses do not get built. It means workers cannot find somewhere to live. It means families who want to put down their roots in our communities find it increasingly difficult to do so. There are two matters from Warren Blackwood that I want the government to consider as part of this debate. The first is the commencement date for these new transfer duty thresholds. Under the bill, the increased thresholds apply to transactions entered into from the 7th of May 2026. Every change like this needs a commencement date. I accept this. But there are cases where applying that date without any discretion produces an outcome that is difficult to regard as fair. A constituent of mine, a 33-year-old mechanical fitter buying his first block of land in Witchcliffe. He signed the contract in December 2025. He worked hard, saved his money and committed to building his first home. The subdivision titles have taken longer than expected to issue. They are now expected in late August 2026. That delay was outside his control. But because he signed his contract before the 7th of May, he stands to receive substantially less assistance than another first home buyer purchasing comparable land after that date. The difference is not their circumstances, it is not their income, it is not whether they are genuinely buying their first home. It is simply when the contract was signed and how long that subdivision process took. In plain language, someone can do everything right and still miss out because it took a little longer to issue. My constituent is not asking government to rewrite the entire scheme. And he puts it to me, he's not asking for special treatment, he's asking for a fair go. And I think that is a reasonable request. And I ask the Minister for Finance to consider whether there is scope for a narrow transitional arrangement for genuine first home buyers who committed shortly before the 7th of May, but whose settlement occurred afterwards because of circumstances outside their control. It could require evidence of the original contract, the reasons for the delay and confirmation that the purchaser otherwise meets the first home buyer requirements. The government can maintain a clear commencement date while still recognising genuine cases where people have been caught through no fault of their own. The second issue goes to a wider problem with housing affordability. Helping someone purchase land is important, but that assistance does not achieve much if the planning system then makes it unnecessarily expensive or difficult to build on. I raised this broader problem in my previous contribution on regional housing. Across Warren Blackwood, people are trying to build homes, secondary dwellings and granny flats are running into planning and servicing costs that can stop projects before they even begin. Bushfire attack level assessments are part of that problem, and I want to be very clear about this. Bushfire safety matters. People living in Warren Blackwood understand bushfire risk very well. Nobody is suggesting we weaken sensible measures designed to protect homes and lives. But those measures also need to be consistent, evidence-based and capable of responding when circumstances change. One case in my electorate shows why. A landowner and their property assessed for its bushfire attack level by an accredited assessor. A month later, a second accredited assessor from a different firm assessed the same property. They reached two different ratings. Two qualified professionals, the same property, assessments conducted roughly a month apart with different results. That should at least cause us to ask whether it is reasonable to treat one bail assessment as something that we can permanently determine what happens on that land. Under the subdivision conditions applying in this case, the rating is not simply used to inform the building requirements at that time. A restrictive covenant places it in the title indefinitely. This matters because conditions that determine bushfire risk can change. Vegetation changes, land is cleared or revegetated, surrounding properties change, and fire management changes, yet the covenant remains in place. There is another problem in this particular case. Directly adjoining the property is Crown land containing dead and dying trees, and that vegetation contributes to the fire risk affecting the neighbouring property. If a private landowner failed to manage a serious fire hazard, the community would reasonably expect actions to be taken. Government-owned land should be subject to the same expectation. It is difficult to tell a private landowner that a bushfire assessment must permanently restrict their title while vegetation contributing to the assessment remains unmanaged on adjoining Crown land. That is the practical contradiction here. A local shire has considered this issue. Its planning department supported replacing the permanent covenant requirement with a notification on the title recording the BAL assessment that applied at the relevant time. That is not removing the information. It is not hiding the bushfire risk from a future purchaser. It is making sure the title records the information without treating one assessment as permanently correct, regardless of what substantially happens on that property or around that property. Importantly, that type of notification approach is already used by the West Australia Planning Commission elsewhere in the same approval. The Shire put that proposal to the Commission and it was rejected. The landowner then raised the matter directly and it was rejected again. So I asked the government to reconsider that approach. If the government says a permanent covenant is necessary, then the underlying assessment needs to be reliable enough to justify permanently restricting the title. Where two accredited assessors can reach different conclusions on the same property without a short period, there should be a reasonable mechanism to review that assessment. And where the physical conditions surrounding the property change, there should be a practical way for title arrangements to reflect that. So that is not weakening bushfire protection, it is making the systems work properly. And this goes to the broader point I've made previously about regional housing. A housing target that does not build a house, available land does not build a house, a transfer duty concession does not build a house. Someone still has to be able to take a block of land through the planning system, connect it to services and afford the construction. In towns like Warren Blackwood, these additional costs matter. In places such as Boyartbrook and Pemberton, headworks and servicing costs can make developments unviable before a slab is poured. Elsewhere, homeowners look at secondary dwellings or relatively modest developments run into BAL requirements and planning conditions that can make sensible projects too difficult to proceed with. Every time one of these projects is abandoned, another potential home is lost, and that has consequences beyond the individual landowner. I hear from communities struggling to find accommodation for nurses, teachers, tradespeople and other workers. Businesses struggle to recruit because prospective employees cannot find somewhere to live. Families who would like to settle in our towns look elsewhere. This is why a regional housing policy cannot just be announcing a statewide number. It has to deal with the reasons homes are not being built in particular communities. Madam Speaker, I support this bill. Reducing transfer duty for home buyers will help people, and that should be acknowledged. But affordability does not end when the contract is signed. It includes whether a first home buyer is treated fairly when delays outside their control push settlements beyond a government cut-off. It includes whether someone who has bought land can actually afford to build on it. And it includes whether our planning and bushfire requirements are consistent, current and proportionate. For Warren Blackwood, I am asking the government to do two practical things. First, the Minister for Finance should examine a tightly defined transitional arrangement for genuine first home buyers who committed shortly before the 7th of May 2026 and whose settlement was delayed through circumstances outside their control. And second, the Minister responsible for the West Australian Planning Commission should review the use of permanent bail restrictive covenants where there is credible evidence the assessments are inconsistent or circumstances have materially changed, and consider whether a notification on title can provide the necessary information without permanently locking in an outdated assessment. Neither proposal undermines the purpose of this bill. There are practical changes that recognise what people actually experience when they try to buy land and build a home. And if we are serious about housing affordability, we have to deal with those costs as well. Thank you.
Wait for the mic. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I appreciate the member for Warren Blackwood confirming his support for the bill. I think this bill